Thanks for rejoining after the coffee session. So we at the MEF, I think Dario mentioned yesterday there was a report on mobile services with disabled people in mind. A really interesting report that you should download if you get the chance. And sort of sticking with that theme, the next session is Keeping It Human, Navigating the Environmental, Social and Governance Pillars of Personal Data Management. So really looking at how to keep those user interfaces human-centric. And to manage this session, I'm going to hand over to Nicky Hickman, and she will moderate and introduce the speakers. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Can you hear me? Yes. Hello, ladies. So I'm Nicky Hickman. I'm a freelancer, and I work with personal data, digital identity, and in a previous life, I worked in the telco sector. So if you could each introduce yourselves, pass to Gema first.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Gema Esteban. I'm head of ESG at IG4 Capital, private equity company.
And Chris?
Oh, me?
Yes, just introduce yourself.
I've got to press the button.
Yeah.
Is that working now? Yes.
Yeah.
Good morning, everybody, and hi, Gema in Madrid. Yes, I work as a telecom analyst. I was the author of the report just referred to around people with disability and accessibility, and delighted to be here.
Thank you. Sarah?
Hello, everyone. Hi, Nicky. Also very happy to be here. I'm an independent identity consultant and I work with a number of organisations, and today I'm representing Women in Identity, who do a lot of work, fantastic work in ID inclusion.
Thank you. So ESG, I thought it would be useful just to give everyone the Investopedia definition. So it's environmental, social and governance criteria are a set of standards for a company's operations that socially conscious investors use to screen potential investments. Environmental criteria consider how a company performs as a steward of nature. Social criteria examine how it manages relationships with employees, suppliers, customers, and the communities where it operates. And governance deals with a company's leadership, executive pay, audits, internal controls, and shareholder rights. And I've been really intrigued by ESG for the last couple of years because I did some research. The Turing Institute trusted digital infrastructures, and we looked at the fate of informal sector workers in the garment manufacturing industry in India. And it was obvious that without an identity, without the ability to assert their role as a worker, they were severely disadvantaged. So as well as investors, workers, and customers are interested in ESG. They might not call it that. So just a couple of stats for you. So customers, PwC reported that 76% of consumers say they will stop buying from companies that treat the environment, employees, or the community in which they operate poorly. And 88% of consumers will be more loyal to company that supports social or environmental issues. And when it comes to employees, a study found that organizations with the highest employee satisfaction had ESG scores that were 14% higher than the global average. Regulators are also very interested in this for obvious reasons. And overall, for example, the EU Commission has proposed a directive that would enforce due diligence on companies in their ESG reporting. At the moment, it's a reporting requirement, a bit different from due diligence. So the data that operators, that mobile devices, that wearables and so on provide both from and about the individual and the places they are, and from and about the things that they produce in their supply chains, is, it seems to me, a huge opportunity for the mobile industry. So there's a profit opportunity. ESG data markets were worth $1 billion in 2021, and growing at a 20% rate, CAGR. But there's a big gap around social, the S pillar. That is only 5% of that market at the moment. So there are new revenue opportunities from old data sets, I would say. And in many ways, this seems to me to be analogous with Sarbanes-Oxley, which, if any of you remember that, really kicked off enterprise identity management as a big regulatory driver. And the promise that I think is important and of interest to this panel is that finally ESG can move socially responsible business out of the CSR department, the marketing department, and into the core of the business, into supply chain management and sourcing and employee relations. But I am not an expert. I am just learning about this myself. So each of the panelists is now going to give their perspectives and views, and we've got some views from an investor perspective, also from worker and consumer perspectives. So starting with Gema, would you like to give us your perspectives?
Of course. Thank you very much again for inviting me to talk about ESG in this fantastic forum. And first of all, let me talk about how big is the whole ESG market. Apart from what you have just introduced about how big is the data, the ESG data market, according to Bloomberg Intelligence, asset under management are going to exceed $41 trillion this year and $50 trillion in 2025. Which will represent 1/3 of all asset under management in the world. This obviously means that ESG is not a bubble, it's not a kind of, something that's going to disappear, it's here to stay. Also, I would like to point that according to a survey conducted by MSCI to 200 asset owners, 62% cited climate change or ESG measurement as a top 3 impactful trend in the next 3 to 5 years, and 73% plan to increase their own ESG investments either significantly or moderately by the end of 2021. Therefore, capital allocation, whether it is in equity or fixed income, is very much growing in the telco ESG world. For example, again, an MSCI study published in April this year that more than 1 trillion of investments in communication, so in our industry, in the telco industry, is in ESG mutual funds or ETFs. And also, since the first green bond of the whole telecommunication for $1 billion issued by Telefonica back in 2019. It's now super common to see telcos issuing green bonds, sustainable bonds, all the flavors of bonds that are related to sustainability nowadays. So let's talk about why companies and telcos should matter ESG, why they should take this into account in their strategies, in their reporting, in their investments. Well, I think that rising ESG standards and practices drive 3 major outcomes for companies. No? First, it answers rising consumer demands, as you very well mentioned at the beginning, Nicky, and I'm pretty sure that Chris and Sarah are going to talk about that. The consumer demands for more sustainable and ethics products and practices. So their customers are asking for that. Second, it may improve efficiencies, either efficiencies or increase revenues, and we will see how. And third, access to cheaper capital and better valuation, by the way, no? As we have seen, because there are many, many investors looking for good ESG performance to invest in. So let's talk about which are the telcos' most important ESG topics. And we're going to talk about data, of course. First of all, it is extremely important for me and for investment world is to understand the company core business and focus on the financially material key topics for that industry or company. For example, for telcos, let's talk about telcos. There are different key topics in the 3 letters, yeah? So talking about the environmental one, there are 2 main things, right? The telecom industry is focusing primarily on GHG emissions and waste management. So these are the 2 main topics for ESG in telcos in the environmental part. Telefonica and Nokia, for example, commissioned a study that demonstrated that 5G is up to 90% more efficient than 4G in terms of energy consumption, as well as fiber is, where it is 85% more efficient than copper networks, primarily because there is a huge decommission of broadband premises. The GSMA also suggests that the telecom industry can enable emissions reductions in other industries through digitalization, such as with smart grids, smart cities, smart buildings, transportation, using IoT, using big data, which could save 70.7 billion tons of CO2 emissions per year, which means, for those of you that are familiar with these crazy figures on GHG emissions and everything, it represents more than 10% of the total industries and worldwide GHG emissions. So they are a driver for reducing emissions for other industries. Most operators also report on the number of devices that they collect to prevent e-waste. No, this is the second topic, the waste management, such as the 229 million devices collected by AT&T, which were refurbished, either refurbished or recycled, or for example, Orange, which reported that it collected mobile phones equivalent to 15% of its sales volumes in Europe in 2020. No? So let's move to social, which is a very, very, I would say, unknown and very interesting pillar from the 3 layers. No? There are some key business aspects of ESG, like, of course, digital inclusion, child protections, which are related to reduce the digital gap with rural population, elderly people, disabilities, as very well Chris mentioned, and he's super expert on that, educating children. But this panel is going to talk about this later on. Let me dive a little bit on data privacy, which is the theme of the forum. Yeah. So this is the big theme on the I would say the whole digital industry. Data privacy is a human right declared by the UN Declarations of Human Rights. In the digital space, what is sought here is to promote freedom of expression and privacy on the internet through practices which respect the protection and protect the user rights. Yeah. So for investors, and from the governance perspective, let's say, it is required transparency on policies, how you manage data increase, reporting on which are the number of data increase that you have had, data deletion, data security breaches, number of fines. This is what you will find in the annual reports of the telco industry required from data privacy. But I think that is much broader. This is something that is very much linked with the strategy of the company. You know? I like to call it digital confidence, yeah, because for customers, trust, which is a very nice word, and I like very much, and that's something that we have been discussing a lot with Chris many times in the telecom industry. Maybe for customers, trust is probably the most important value when they set up a digital relationship with you. And of course, this is not only for telcos. Imagine for Google, Facebook, or the big internet giants. No? And digital confidence is based in three fundamental pillars that I think that work together. No, one is privacy, another one is transparency, third one is security. So I think that people and our customers must have assurance that one, companies will not use their data in an unexpected, obscure, or abusive way. Two, they will be informed about who handles their data, what purpose is it used for. Third, the data will be canceled according to the defined policy, also when they request it, or even before, by exercising their cancellation rights, which is very clearly stated in the GDPR. Fourth, they will have the necessary tools so that they can access and update or delete or do whatever they want with their personal data information. And finally, that there are robust security measures and technical resources to avoid the loss of data, no? Misuse or unauthorized access to their data, right? So as a summary, I would say that customer relationships based on trust are one of the most material issues for telcos in this industry. And of course, it's also a super challenge, no, for all of us. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Gema. The numbers being thrown around are quite astonishing, aren't they? And as an analyst, I'm always looking for the data point. Obviously, I'm a telecom analyst, but I'm also visually impaired, or I have been blind for 30 years now. So I've been looking at the market and how the segmentation breaks down. And as Gema's pointed out, the S bit of ESG and the impact that has is really fascinating from that point of view. We use this acronym, People with Disability, PWD, which could also stand for People Without Disability, just to confuse matters. But roughly there are 1 billion people in the world who have some form of disability in the way it's categorized. Now that is roughly 1 in 7 of the population. So for any market in which you're involved, 1 in 7 are going to have some sort of requirement, customization, personalization in terms of the way the service gets delivered. And I think that the fact that hearing impaired is the biggest category, then vision impaired, and actually we don't really know about the cognitive dimensions of the market because it's really just coming into people's minds and the way it gets identified and categorized. But the fact is, it's an enormous number, and you match that also with the issue around the digital divide, and where people don't have access to the services that we're talking about today. And if you believe the figures, 30-40% of the world population don't have good access. So one of the issues that we face is how do we use identity? How do we get the service to the people? How do we get people to use the service and become part of this massive ecosystem in which we're all involved, and do that in a sustainable way? And certainly my involvement has been around this people with disability concept, but also around the broader telecom industry, because it's not only serving the customers, so how we all interact with our telco providers or with the broader ecosystem as we now get involved with, but it's also about the dimension within the organizations themselves, and how do we build a more inclusive workforce within the world's telcos. So it's represented on many different levels, and I think the cultural diversity, and not just with PWD, but the stuff that Sarah will talk about and stuff that Nicky's already touched upon, that cultural diversity just makes organizations so much more aware of the requirements of people with those different end user requirements. And ultimately, this is an end user requirement issue. And I think that the challenge of the industry today is moved away from when we used to be this nice self-contained telecom industry, where we literally controlled every point of the service and the device at the end of it. We're now involved in this much wider ecosystem in which any number of different parties may have different bits of data about the customer, about the service, and therefore about that interaction. So if we're going to customize it and we're going to be socially responsible and ultimately long-term sustainable, then we need to find some way of making sure that information gets carried through to whoever's delivering the final service, because it's just going to get more complicated as we move to B2B to X type business models. So I think the fact that we're talking here specifically about the mobile industry, actually that's part of that broader set of services that we consume as individuals and businesses, and actually allowing the channels of interaction to be identified and customizable. So if I'm not going to read my physical bill, even if they send it to me, but I want to be able to get access, preferably to someone to talk to me about the service. So we have all of these technological building blocks at our disposal, but actually very rarely is it identified. And certainly as a blind person, I'm actually very happy that my service providers know that I can't see very well, and therefore they adjust the service accordingly. Many people in the disability community, if I can use that phrase, which is a bit meaningless, but I think you get my drift. Many people are very wary of sharing that information. The fear that they're not going to be, as Gema pointed out, they're not going to be served in a particularly appropriate way. And I think many of these issues also apply to the broader market. And in the future, I can certainly see, my bot negotiating with the BT bot or a 3 bot or whatever to get the best service for my particular usage. So we have some big issues around AI, and I'm sure Nicky will come on to this a bit later. But all of that data is one thing, but then the interpretation of the data and how I might have someone working on my behalf to work with the industry, and how an industry partner might have it, let alone the ecosystem I just described. And I think that challenge is there. And I think what we should point out from the start here is that in the past, certainly as I grew up and when I went to blind school in the 70s, the technology was very clunky. It was very visually impaired specific. It was very expensive. We now have in our hands or in our pockets now, a device in the mobile device, which is fundamentally very accessible and adaptable to people with many different conditions that we can use as that common denominator, and therefore we have the scale to build it. We're not just dealing with the visually impaired, we're dealing with all sorts of different types of user. And in the design world, since we're talking here about inclusion, the notion of inclusive design, where rather than adding something on afterwards, a clunky, expensive thing like I would have used in the 70s and 80s, actually we get that into the process at the beginning, and we talk about designing from scratch and making sure that things are accessible from scratch, and therefore embracing all of those different standards around accessibility. And by the way, the benefit of that is that even though we're designing for the edge, if you like, for the periphery of society and business, actually by making it accessible for those, we get the center for free. In the past, we designed for the center, for the sort of common usage patterns. Actually, you can't then adapt that for the outside. If we design for the edge, we get the center for free, which means actually everything becomes much more accessible. And using technology like smart speaker and the like actually really raises the profile of services, and it gives us access because everything is digital. It does raise many questions around the social side, as I said, around employment and around the governance. And it really does need to be positioned to make sure the service is delivered for the benefit of the customer. And I certainly think in our telecom industry, with all due respect to the industry, we didn't do that in the past. We designed technology first and then we exposed it to the customer. We're now in a position where actually we're designing for the customer, including all of these issues that Gema's talked about and that I've talked about. And it is gaining traction. I'm really pleased in terms of, I only got involved in this probably 10 years ago, having focused primarily on the telecom industry and all of its manifestations and machinations. But actually, it really is gaining traction. I'm delighted to say in many of the telcos that I deal with around the world, this notion of inclusion and actually making sure the identity of the individual and the service delivered to them is much more customizable. And in fact, I'll leave you with one thought from a guy called Larry Goldberg, who was at Verizon Media and been very involved in captioning and the use of captioning for all the services. And he had 3 mantras that he used and actually was actually delivered by Hans Vestberg, the former head of Ericsson, now the head of Verizon. And he said, first of all, we shift left. We don't start later on. We put the accessibility and the inclusion bit at the beginning of the process, which means that then every service is then born accessible. And then the third bit is no regression. And the no regression is probably most important because you tend to get people who address things in the short term and they bring in inclusive design. But then when someone else redesigns the application and it loses its accessibility. So we need to have this as part of a continuous cycle. We're always thinking about including everybody in the design. And of course, that includes how we use the data, how we use people's identity. But the great news is that the change in ecosystem in which you're all active actually there is a role for everybody to make sure that wherever the application is being used, on what device it's being used, that it becomes much more accessible, available, yes, to people with disability, but also to those people who've not been digitally connected. And that just expands the market. And the people with disability, the billion people I mentioned to you, spending power, even on a rough economic calculation, is about 1.4 trillion. So I think we've had many trillions and billions and millions of figures. But just to put it in context, it's an enormous market. The potential is vast. The potential is good from an economic point of view, but for bringing people into this digital society is even bigger.
Sarah.
Thanks, Nicky. I lost the sound for a moment there. Just as you were, I think, asking me, I heard my name, which always helps. Chris, thank you so much. I'm going to start by picking up on something that Chris has pointed out, which is that the disability market is an enormous market. And I hadn't intended to talk about something particularly personal, but I am going to start with this. I just wanted to emphasize that 1 billion statistic that Chris has equated to 1.4 trillion. I would suggest maybe much larger than that. And also that to emphasize all of us, are only able-bodied and able-minded for periods in our lives. And all of us at some point in our lives will experience, if we haven't yet, periods where we have some form of disability. And I found in 2004, I had an accident and I found myself with acquired brain injury, which meant that I could no longer speak English. For some period of time, and I had a number of different issues. I had at that point worked in the digital industry for since 1994, when I set up a .com and went to Silicon Valley to go boom and bust, which is great fun. And I made a lot of mistakes. But by that point in 2004, I was probably one of the early adopters. I had, for that whole period, been banging a drum of we need to test. I mean, at that point, testing was something you did at the end of the life cycle of design. And I'd always been very focused on a consumer-centric approach, although that wasn't the terminology back in 1994 in the Valley. And I found myself then in 2004, as I was recovering from acquired brain injury under a fantastic set of doctors at the Maudsley Brain Hospital in London, having real difficulties using mobile phones and online, anything at all. And these were, as Chris has said, we're not quite sure what the size of the market is for the cognitive element. He talked about the auditory and also visual impairment element, but the cognitive element, because it's such a wide definition, there's so many different cognition challenges fall into that, including very low levels of learning. For example, the UK, as a developed market, has the second lowest literacy rate in Europe, second after the Ukraine. So if you can't perform a basic search and haven't been taught how to use an encyclopedia or a dictionary, you're really going to have trouble whether you're on a mobile phone or any other device to perform some services. So consumer-concentric design is absolutely essential. And in terms of cognition, which is very, very wide, and includes all types of learning levels, as well as all sorts of acquired injuries and all sorts of cognition-related impairments that people might have, is something that we don't know the scale of it at the moment. But certainly people still spend money or want to spend money on services. I was helping, I was on the steering group as I recovered with the Maudsley Brain Hospital to help create a cognitive behavioural therapy online service, which was also mobile, for people who had what I had experienced, which was acquired brain injury. And all of these fantastic doctors who were absolutely marvellous in terms of online had got it wrong, because the amount of time that someone could spend on an exercise was somewhere in the region of about 5 minutes, and each of these exercises were about 20 minutes. There was no way someone with the condition that I had could have stayed online long enough, whether it was on a mobile phone or any other device, in order to perform this task that was going to help them with their recovery. Now, that's a very, very small but real life example that I experienced. And so it's an example that I use because then when I went back into the workplace, which ironically was with the Department of Health in the UK, with the NHS helping to turn the strategy of taking the NHS online, and which was through NHS Choices at the time, nhs.uk. It's the most used online health service now in the world in terms of numbers of people using it and information. I found myself in a much better position to really understand, although I'd always been banging this drum, what it really meant to people, individuals, in order to benefit both the industry and wider if we get this right. And now, fast forward, I find myself focused on the S in ESG. So this social perspective, which in the recent work that I've been collaborating with Women in Identity, and Women in Identity's whole focus is to enable ID systems to be more diverse and to include, to be all inclusive. So ID systems made for people, made for everyone by everyone. Now, we can't have everyone in a design team, that's impossible. So what we are suggesting that we create internationally an ID code of conduct, different industries have this, and that we also create a kind of how to do it interactive guide with our sponsors. There's a number of sponsors that we work with, including MasterCard and some large organisations around the world who understand and are very sympathetic to the potential in terms of growth for their business, the potential in terms of growth for the nations that they operate within, and also the potential for the consumer to reap the benefits. And this is, Chris mentioned the word ecosystem, and I think this is an ecosystem that is an ecosystem that's an emotional ecosystem, because through some of the work that I've done on the ground, I've seen the emotional impact on human beings when they've not been able to access, and I've experienced it myself, not being able to use systems and have been then locked out of society because of that. So people not being able to get a job because they don't have the breeder documents to prove they are who they say they are. And this is absolutely core and fundamental to every single service, whichever platform or channel it's being delivered by. Being able to prove who you are online. If one can't do that, one can't access services. I also do work with the Open Identity Exchange, and this is a very large proportion of the population of the planet. In the UK, we did the most detailed analysis last year, and I was lucky enough to be authoring and leading on that report for the Open Identity Exchange. The UK ID, a number of people in the UK who are excluded from being able to prove who they are online. So this means any service where you have to do that, which is most services, all services that include payments. If it's for a bank account or something like that, online banking, that type of service, is 12 to 15% of the UK population. The figure we came up with, which is at the lower end of the scale of the range, is 5.9 million adults in the UK. Looking at we did this work with Experian, so it was very detailed. That's an enormous proportion of people who could be spending money on various things, on products and services. We imagine that would be very similar for other developed economies. And as the McKinsey report, which people are maybe aware of, noted, between 3% and 13% of the gross domestic product of nations would be increased if we had inclusion in identity. So for a developed economy like the US or the UK, we'd probably be looking more towards 3%. And for an emerging economy like Ghana, for example, we'd probably be looking more towards 13%. Even at the lower end of that spectrum, that's an enormous figure. And obviously the gross domestic product of a nation being impacted that much will mean that there's more money going around in general. And certainly from an individual perspective, that would equate to services being far more accessible for people, and their experience of interacting in society and community being far more enjoyable and also inclusive, which then gives people a sense of belonging and a sense of identifying, to go back to use the word identify, with the communities that they're living in. So feeling that they're part of those communities and they're not isolated. And we know the consequences of isolation, unfortunately, because of what we've recently, all of us, been through, and the enormous increase in suicide rates as a result of isolation. So inclusiveness, being able to identify with society, is all important for individuals. And so the ID code of conduct that Women in Identity are developing, and we're talking to a number of different organisations and nations and standards bodies, is being seen as a way of, one, from some organisations in some countries, particularly some emerging economies, a way of avoiding long and lengthy and very expensive creation of legislation if we can achieve adoption. And it's being seen also from an organisational perspective as a way of aligning the organisation with the S in ESG in part, because what it will enable design teams in identity, creation of identity systems, which is the core of, as I said before, the core of all services, to do, is to have a standard way of delivering and enabling people to prove they are who they say they are online, much easier and without so much stress for the individual. So I'm going to stop there. And Nicky, I hope that's answered your question from the S perspective.
Yeah, definitely.
2 minutes, Nicky. About 2-3 minutes left, Nicky.
Oh, right. Well, we're going to go straight to
Your mic's on.
questions from the room. And time for any questions? We've answered them all. Brilliant. Genius. I've got one question, which I think I put to Gema, if that's okay. We've only got a couple of minutes, but what do you think the main challenges for the mobile industry are? We've talked a bit about the opportunity for these different stakeholder groups.
Sure. Yeah, let me raise one debate point here. That is, to what extent the user is knowledgeable about how worthy are the data? Is the data? Do we need a whole process of education for users on transparency and database economy? What the current big internet players' business models are based on, for example? No, let's remember that the top 10 market capitalization companies in the world are now big internet players, which relies on data at all. No? So my question here that I would share with you and with the audience is, to what extent users, consumers are really understanding what is this about. Finally, one of the big challenges for the industry, I would say, that is how to monetize this. How to monetize this, either reducing risk, which is one nice way to approach the issue, or is there a way to create revenues of this? I would leave it like that. Nicky.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you and to Susan for inviting us and Michael. We're done.
Goodbye.